On February 18, 2001, more than 17 million people were watching live television as one of the greatest drivers who ever lived took the final turn of his career. Within a single second, the roar of 43 engines dropped into a silence that no fan in that stadium will ever forget. What you are about to hear is not just a list of crashes. It is the story of the men who gave everything for a sport they loved, the families who watched it happen in real time, and the changes those tragedies forced onto an entire industry that refused, for decades, to admit just how dangerous it really was. Some of these moments were captured on live broadcast television in front of millions of people. Others happened quietly, away from the cameras, in empty practice sessions when almost nobody was watching at all. But every single one of them left a permanent mark on NASCAR, and by the time we reach the final story, you will understand why so many people still call it the day racing changed forever. So stay with me until the end, because there is a chilling detail in that final crash, something the cameras caught almost by accident, that still gives longtime fans goosebumps whenever it is mentioned, even more than 2 decades later. And along the way, you are going to notice something strange, something that racing historians still argue about to this day. 2 of these tragedies happened at the exact same corner of the exact same racetrack, only weeks apart from each other. Keep that in mind as we go, because by the time we get there, you will understand why so many people inside the sport started to believe the racetrack was cursed. Let's start with a name that a lot of casual fans have never even heard, but one that old-school NASCAR diehards will never forget. His name was J.D. McDuffie, and for nearly 3 decades, he was the definition of the underdog. While other drivers had wealthy sponsors, factory-backed cars, and entire teams of engineers, McDuffie ran his operation practically out of his own garage. He built his own cars with his own hands. He worked on his own engines late into the night when everyone else had gone home. He raced against millionaires with a fraction of their budget, and somehow, week after week, year after year, he kept showing up anyway. Fans loved him for it. He was not chasing fame. He was chasing the one thing that had eluded him for 29 long years in the sport, a single win at the highest level. On August 11, 1991, at Watkins Glen International in New York, McDuffie climbed into his car for what would become his final race. Early in the event, another car spun directly in front of him. There was nowhere to go. McDuffie's car slammed into the wreck at full speed, and the impact tore through the driver's side of the vehicle. Track workers rushed to the scene, but there was nothing anyone could do. He was 52 years old. The tragedy stunned the entire paddock. Drivers who had raced against him for years, men who considered him a fixture of the sport as permanent as the checkered flag itself, struggled to process the loss. Fans who had cheered for the little team with the biggest heart in racing were left in disbelief. What made it even harder to accept was that McDuffie had quietly told friends he was thinking about retiring soon, about finally stepping away from the sport he had given his entire life to. He never got that chance. In the years that followed, safety experts pointed to his crash as an early warning sign of a problem NASCAR would not fully address for another decade: the danger of side impact collisions at extremely high speed. But at the time, almost nobody wanted to hear it. Racing was racing, and the risks were simply treated as part of the deal. To really understand why nobody stepped in sooner, you have to understand the culture of the sport at that time. For most of NASCAR's history, danger was not treated as a flaw in the system. It was treated as part of the appeal. Cars had thin roll cages by today's standards. Barriers around most tracks were solid, unforgiving concrete built to stop a car, not to absorb the force of the impact. Drivers wore basic helmets and simple harnesses, and if you asked most of them at the time whether they were afraid, they would tell you fear was something you left in the garage before you climbed through the window net. That mentality had already cost the sport dozens of lives across the decades before McDuffie ever got behind the wheel, yet very little had changed. It would take a string of losses, one right after another, before the people running the sport were finally forced to listen. That mindset was about to be tested again and again in ways nobody could have predicted. But if you think that was the last time NASCAR would lose one of its own that decade, you were not even close. Because just 3 years later, the sport would be rocked twice in the span of a single week, and what happened during that stretch remains one of the strangest, most haunting coincidences in the history of American racing. In February of 1994, NASCAR arrived at Daytona International Speedway for preseason testing, the very same track that hosts the sport's biggest race every single year. Neil Bonnett was a beloved veteran, a former star driver turned television broadcaster who had stepped away from full-time racing after a serious head injury years earlier. But Bonnett could not stay away from the sport he loved, and he made the decision to attempt a comeback. On February 11th, during a practice run, his car suddenly turned sharply into the outside wall in turn 4. The impact was severe, and Bonnett died at the track that day. He was 47 years old. The racing community was devastated. Bonnett was not just a driver, he was a mentor, a friend, a familiar and trusted voice fans welcomed into their living rooms every single week. Tributes poured in from every corner of the sport almost immediately. But nobody could have imagined what was about to happen just 4 days later. On February 15th, a young, up-and-coming driver named Rodney was also testing at Daytona, hoping to make a name for himself at the sport's top level. During his practice run, in almost the exact same section of the track where Bonnett had crashed only days earlier, Orr's car also turned sharply and struck the wall. He was killed instantly. He was only 31 years old, with what many believed was a bright and promising future still ahead of him. 2 fatal accidents in the same corner, within the same week, at the same speedway. The eerie repetition sent a wave of genuine fear through the entire garage. Drivers who had walked past Bonnett's wrecked car just days earlier now had to process the loss of a second competitor in almost the exact same spot on the track. Some drivers reportedly considered walking away from the sport altogether that week. Others quietly admitted, for the first time in their careers, just how fragile the illusion of control really was at nearly 200 miles an hour. NASCAR officials launched investigations into both crashes, looking for any mechanical or track-related explanation for why 2 cars would fail in the same way, in the same location, within days of one another. No single definitive cause was ever fully agreed upon, and that lack of a clear answer made the tragedy even harder for the racing community to accept. How do you protect against something you cannot even explain? For a sport built entirely on speed, precision, and control, that unanswered question hung heavily over Daytona for years to come. And it was about to happen again, this time to a family whose name was practically synonymous with NASCAR itself. Because 6 years later, in the year 2000, tragedy would strike not once, but twice, at the very same New Hampshire racetrack, in a coincidence so unsettling that even hardened NASCAR veterans still talk about it with a chill in their voice to this day. To understand why Adam Petty's death hit the sport so hard, you have to understand who the Pettys actually were. Richard Petty, Adam's grandfather, is often called the King of NASCAR, a 7-time champion whose name is written into the very foundation of the sport itself. Adam's father, Kyle Petty, carried the family legacy forward into the next generation. And Adam, just 19 years old, was being groomed to become the 4th generation of Pettys to race at NASCAR's highest level. He was not just talented, he was beloved. Fans saw in him the future of a sport built on family and tradition. A young man carrying the weight of one of racing's most iconic surnames with a humility and grace far beyond his years. On May 12, 2000, Adam was practicing at New Hampshire Motor Speedway ahead of a lower-tier race. During what should have been a routine lap, something went badly wrong with the throttle on his car. Investigators later determined it had become stuck, sending the car accelerating uncontrollably straight into the wall in turn 3. Adam Petty was killed instantly. The sport went into mourning almost overnight. Richard Petty, a man who had spent his entire life inside race cars, now had to bury his own grandson, a young man who had inherited not just his name, but his very passion for the sport itself. Kyle Petty, devastated beyond words, made the decision to keep racing, saying publicly that stopping would not bring his son back, and that continuing was the only way he knew how to honor him. Fans across the country sent letters, flowers, and tributes to the Petty family estate by the thousands. Drivers wore memorial stickers on their cars for the remainder of the season. For a sport that had always celebrated speed and danger as part of its very identity, Adam's death forced a painful and long overdue conversation. Was racing simply accepting too much risk as the cost of entertainment? NASCAR promised to review safety procedures at every track on the circuit. But reviews take time, and tragedy, as the sport was about to learn in the most devastating way imaginable, does not wait for paperwork to be finished. In the years that followed, Kyle Petty channeled his grief into something extraordinary. He and his family opened a camp for children with serious illnesses, giving thousands of kids who never got the chance at a normal childhood a place to simply be kids again, all in Adam's memory. It remains one of the most quietly beautiful legacies to ever come out of a NASCAR tragedy, proof that even the deepest grief can be turned into something that keeps giving long after the cameras stop rolling. Just 7 weeks later, on that exact same corner of that exact same track, lightning struck twice, and what happened next was so eerily similar to Adam Petty's crash that some longtime fans still refuse to believe it was simply a coincidence, even now, more than 20 years later. Kenny Irwin Jr. was a rising star, a former motocross champion who had transitioned into stock car racing and quickly built a reputation as a fearless, aggressive competitor. He had raw talent, natural charisma, and the kind of blistering speed that made team owners take notice immediately. On July 7, 2000, just weeks after the racing world had buried Adam Petty, Irwin arrived at New Hampshire Motor Speedway for a practice session ahead of the Cup Series race. What happened next felt almost impossible to believe. In nearly the same corner where Adam Petty had crashed less than 2 months earlier, Irwin's throttle also became stuck. His car accelerated into the wall at full speed, with almost no time to react at all. He died from his injuries. He was 30 years old. The racing community was left in a state of complete disbelief. 2 young, promising drivers, dead within 7 weeks of each other, in the exact same section of the exact same racetrack, from what appeared to be the exact same mechanical failure. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a curse. And for a sport already grappling with mounting safety criticism, it became impossible to ignore any longer. NASCAR officials were forced to take immediate action. New Hampshire Motor Speedway made emergency modifications to the corner where both crashes had occurred. Engineers scrambled to investigate the throttle systems used across the sport's entire fleet of cars. But for grieving families and shaken fans, the changes felt like they had come one tragedy too late. Reporters at the time openly questioned whether NASCAR's leadership had done enough after Adam Petty's death to prevent Kenny Irwin's. It was a question that would only grow louder in the months that followed, as the sport braced itself for what would ultimately become the single most devastating and consequential day in its entire history. If you have made it this far, I want you to remember every single name you have just heard, because in a moment, you are going to understand exactly how all of these stories connect to one single afternoon. Because everything you have heard so far, every crash, every loss, every unanswered question, was about to lead to a single afternoon that would change NASCAR forever. It happened on the sport's biggest stage, in front of the largest audience racing had ever seen. And it involved the one driver almost everybody assumed was simply too good, too experienced, too careful to ever become one of these stories. His name was Dale Earnhardt, and by February of 2001, he was already a living legend. 7-time champion, over 30 years in the sport. A driving style so aggressive, so fearless, so uncompromising, that fans and rivals alike gave him a nickname that said absolutely everything: the Intimidator. He was not just one of the greatest drivers who had ever lived. He was the face of NASCAR itself, the very reason millions of new fans had discovered the sport in the first place. If there was one driver nobody expected to become a cautionary tale about racing safety, it was him. February 18, 2001. The Daytona 500, the single biggest race on the entire NASCAR calendar, watched live by millions of people across the country. Earnhardt was running in 3rd place on the final lap, driving defensively to protect 2 of his own team's cars, including one driven by his own son, who was racing toward what would become his very first career win. As the leaders crossed the finish line, Earnhardt's car made contact with another vehicle entering the final turn. What happened next looked, to the untrained eye, like a relatively minor racing incident, the kind of contact drivers walk away from all the time. Earnhardt's car turned sharply and struck the outer wall almost head-on. To most people watching at home, it did not even look like the worst crash of the day. There had been a much more violent, far more spectacular wreck involving multiple cars earlier in that very same race, one that looked significantly more dangerous on television. But appearances were devastatingly deceiving. The precise angle, the exact speed, and the specific forces involved in Earnhardt's impact turned out to be catastrophic in a way that simply was not visible from the outside looking in. Medical teams rushed to the car immediately, but Dale Earnhardt was pronounced dead a short time later. He was 49 years old. What followed was one of the most emotional moments in the history of American sports broadcasting. NASCAR President Mike Helton stepped in front of a room full of reporters, his voice breaking with emotion, and confirmed what millions of fans across the country had feared but desperately refused to believe. NASCAR had lost Dale Earnhardt. Grown men wept openly in the grandstands that day. Racetracks across the country lowered their flags out of respect. Tribute after tribute poured in from every level of motorsport, from casual fans who had only ever known the sport through him, to rival drivers who had spent decades trying and failing to beat him on the racetrack. It felt, to millions of people, like losing a member of their own family. Perhaps the cruelest detail of all is what was happening at the exact same moment on the other side of the track. While emergency crews worked on Earnhardt's car, his son was celebrating in victory lane, having just won his first career race at the highest level, completely unaware that his father was gone. For those first few minutes, one side of Daytona International Speedway was erupting in pure joy. while the other side had just gone completely silent. It would take time before the full weight of what had happened reached everyone at the track at once, and when it did, the celebration turned to heartbreak in an instant. In the days that followed, investigators pored over every inch of the wreckage, examining a broken seatbelt, questioning whether an open-faced helmet had left him exposed in a way a full-face helmet might not have, and debating the exact chain of events that turned an ordinary-looking crash into the sport's darkest day. Every one of those questions eventually led back to the same conclusion. The sport had been getting away with outdated safety standards for far too long, and it had finally run out of luck. But out of that devastating loss came a change that would ultimately save countless lives in the years that followed. NASCAR launched the most extensive safety overhaul in its entire history. Every single car in the sport was mandated to use a head and neck restraint device, something many drivers, including Earnhardt himself, had openly resisted wearing before his death. Tracks across the country began installing energy-absorbing barriers specifically designed to reduce the force of high-speed impacts, a technology now used at nearly every major racetrack in America today. Car designs were completely re-engineered around driver survival, not just raw performance. In the years since Dale Earnhardt's death, not a single driver has lost his life while competing in NASCAR's premier series. Think about that for just a moment. One tragedy on one afternoon in front of one heartbroken nation ended up protecting an entire generation of drivers who came after him. And here is the detail that still gives longtime fans chills. In the final seconds before impact, cameras caught Earnhardt's car in what almost looked like a subtle, controlled move to block the car behind him from getting through, a driver's instinct kicking in even in the very final moment of his life, protecting the two cars racing for the win just ahead of him, one of which belonged to his own son. Whether it was fully intentional or not, nobody will ever truly know for certain. But to this day, many fans still believe that in his very last act behind the wheel, Dale Earnhardt was still doing what he had always done throughout his entire career, putting everything on the line for the people he cared about most in the world. 5 stories. 5 names that racing fans will never forget as long as the sport exists. J.D. McDuffie, the underdog who gave everything for one shot at glory he never got the chance to see. Neil Bonnett and Rodney, 2 lives lost in the same haunting corner within the same devastating week. Adam Petty and Kenny Irwin Jr., 2 young drivers with their entire futures still ahead of them, taken by the same mechanical failure on the same track just 7 weeks apart. And Dale Earnhardt, the biggest star the sport has ever known, whose final lap changed the future of racing forever for every single driver who came after him. What ties every single one of these stories together is not just tragedy. It is the simple fact that each of these men knew exactly what they were risking every single time they climbed behind the wheel of that car, and they did it anyway, because they loved this sport more than almost anything else in their entire lives. Because of what happened to them, drivers today are able to walk away from crashes that would have almost certainly been fatal just 25 years ago. Every head restraint, every energy-absorbing wall, every reinforced roll cage in every single car on the grid today exists because of the lessons the sport was forced to learn, one heartbreaking tragedy at a time. And remember that strange coincidence I mentioned at the very beginning, the same corner, the same track, 2 young lives lost only 7 weeks apart. That is not just a footnote to NASCAR history. It is the exact reason those safety changes could not wait any longer. The exact reason a sport that had spent decades treating danger as entertainment was finally forced to change its identity for good. That is the part of this story that so many people forget. These were not just crashes. They were the reason racing became safer for absolutely everyone who came after them. So the next time you happen to watch a driver walk away from a wreck that looks utterly terrifying on live television, remember that it was not luck. It was the legacy of the men you just heard about. Men who never got that same chance. Men whose names deserve to be remembered, not just for how they lost their lives, but for everything they gave to a sport and to the fans that they loved right up until their very last lap. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while putting it together, let me know in the comments which of these 5 stories affected you the most, and stay close. Because there are more stories like this one still waiting to be told, stories about the people racing almost never talks about, but should never, ever be allowed to forget.